Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Rockland. FacepalmAmerica.com, of course, is where you can always go for more information about the show, to listen to past episodes, and connect with us on social media. Capitalism, the economic system under which we live, is not doing so well as it once was, at least for people in the United States and the West who are used to it benefiting them a little bit more. It seems like it's benefiting fewer and fewer people and taking from more and more people. And in the process, it's kind of destroying the planet that we live on. So it's got some issues, and yet we're in a position as a society, mentally, where we're still trying to at least I wrap my head around the idea that capitalism, isn't that like freedom? Isn't that like democracy? Isn't that what we're trying to spread all over the world? And there are a lot of outdated ideas, frankly, that I have and a lot of other people have that make it difficult to advance when we can clearly see things falling apart around us. But a lot of people are waking up. And fortunately, one of them is Grace Blakeley. She is an author, journalist, and commentator, and she is the author of Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom. Grace, thank you so much for being with us today on Facepalm America.
Thank you so much for having me and for that wonderful introduction.
Well, I think it's important to kind of think about it and wrap our heads around it, because really, there really did not seem to be any alternative to capitalism the way it was projected for a long time, the way I grew up thinking about it in school and as a young person. And I know there's Margaret Thatcher's phrase, there is no alternative. And that really is the way that capitalism has been projected to us. There's basically been a big advertising campaign for the last 100 years or so in which capitalism has tried to associate itself and equate itself with freedom and democracy and everything good. And that is having less influence than it did because we so frequently see the material conditions around us at odds with what is being projected by that system. And people are starting to spend more time thinking about, well, hey, this doesn't really work very well. And so what have you discovered as a part of that process? But I guess what I would ask you to do specifically is start by commenting on that big ad campaign that has been conducted. And the idea is, as Mark Fisher brought up, that capitalism seamlessly occupies the horizons of the possible.
Yeah, I really liked your introduction and the way you framed that question as well, because you came back to this idea that capitalism is the same as kind of freedom and democracy. And that was really a big thing that I wanted to cut through in this book. And I think it's particularly prevalent in the US and the UK and these kind of, arch capitalist societies, the idea that capitalism means free markets and free markets mean freedom. And I really felt the need, especially after the pandemic, when you saw governments distributing so much money to massive corporations, to just take apart that myth that capitalism means free markets. And I do that using a whole bunch of examples. The one that's in the news at the moment actually is Boeing. And I write about Boeing in the opening chapter of the book, just looking at how, the 737 MAX disasters, when these two planes kind of plummeted out of the sky. And it later turned out that Boeing, the top team at Boeing, had known about the flaws in the plane that led it to basically kind of self-hijack effectively, resulting in hundreds of deaths in these two crashes and now all these other engineering failures. And the story is fascinating because you look into how the transformation of Boeing during the 1980s into this just this corporation that was obsessed with maximizing value for shareholders, cut costs at every turn, denigrated engineering expertise, the FAA just completely failing to regulate the firm. And it's easy to look at this as a kind of example of the classic excesses of the free market that just needs to be reined in by the state. And yet Boeing is one of these corporations where, firstly, it doesn't exist in a market. It's part of a duopoly, basically. There's two massive aerospace companies, Airbus and Boeing. There's no free market there. There's no real competition. And also, the government was pumping money into Boeing and giving it loads of support at every turn. Not only was it not being regulated properly, it was the biggest recipient of corporate welfare. One of the biggest recipients of corporate welfare in the US. It got tons of subsidies, tons of tax breaks, had extremely close relationships with the United States federal government, with multiple different departments, was this central part of the military industrial complex, got loads of money during the pandemic. And I think this example just really shows that a lot of the things we're told about capitalism just are wrong. Like, this is a capitalist firm. It does not exist in a free market. Yeah. There are, two companies. They're basically, monopolies. They're able to just decide what to do with little thought of the competition. And then we have this idea that markets are capitalist and states are kind of socialist. Right. And what happens in the economy and in markets is like capitalist, and what happens in the state and in politics is like, about socialism and kind of battles for justice and that sort of thing. And actually, if you look at this example, the American state just props up this big corporation at every turn. And actually, as I look at it in the book, over the course of many chapters, that is what the state does in capitalism. It's not the case that we have this divide between states and markets, politics and economics. We just have all these massive, powerful institutions basically working to promote the interests of the already wealthy.
That's right. I mean, you really can't distinguish between those two entities, the government and capital, and effectively, at least in the United States, and I believe in a lot of Western countries, the government is essentially just acting as an arm of capital in order to not make things fair, but to ensure a profit for capital.
Exactly. Yeah. I look at loads of examples in the book through which this happens. We mentioned already sustainability, for example, and, climate breakdown. I look at the example of ExxonMobil, right? And we always have these debates within the, climate economists and scientists have these debates of, well, should the government do something to protect the environment, or should we just leave it up to the market? And actually, those debates are just taking place on another planet, because it's not the case that we should be asking, should the government do something to stop climate breakdown? It's, should the government literally stop funneling billions of dollars into the corporations that are actively promoting climate breakdown? These companies do not exist in a free market. Many of them would barely be able to make a profit in some years if they didn't have all these subsidies and tax breaks and, governments throwing money at them. This is the case with ExxonMobil as well, which has these very, very deep links with, again, the government in the US. Knew about climate breakdown in the 1970s, I think it was, and as a result, defunded the research for its climate science team. Then one of its, massively increases its profits as it takes money out of research into what it now knows is climate breakdown. Then its CEO goes and works in the Trump administration. You have massive lobbying, donations, just these really close relationships between individuals in ExxonMobil and in the American state. And then lo and behold, you get, a president coming in, President Biden, who says, I want to tackle climate breakdown. And he does very little, and in fact ends up actually expanding offshore drilling licenses, actually facilitating fossil fuel companies. And I look at this and I say, this looks kind of contradictory, doesn't it? I thought ExxonMobil was friends with the Republicans and they all like oil, and the Democrats like, things to be clean and sustainable and nice and whatever. But actually, I look at how these relationships between corporations and states aren't just about relationships between political parties. They're about how political power works in modern capitalist systems. And those relationships go so much deeper than just individual politicians, and actually relate to how companies like ExxonMobil, like Boeing, are really just, integrated into the veins and arteries of political power.
Yeah, I mean, it more so than just like an individual politician or even in individual party. It's suffused their power throughout the system, and that is why companies of any size give, they might favor one side or another, but they give hefty donations to both major political parties to make sure, because they know that administrations are going to change and they're still going to be there. I mean, really, if you look at Washington, D.C., the true power resides not on Capitol Hill, but on K Street, where the lobbyists' offices are. And it's just amazing the power that the phrase "the market" or the free market has. It didn't get there for no reason. We didn't just all of a sudden start believing it. It was repeated to us again and again in the media through outlets that got a lot of money from ultimately these companies, or through groups that were controlled by these companies. And that's become the standard language now. One of the big questions that I have for you, given all these issues, and they are very vital and they are very urgent, but we have a big problem to overcome. I think especially for members of my generation and older, because we tend to be, I'm a member of Generation X, and I first started forming my political structures in my mind during the Cold War, and that sort of like thinking was very powerful at that time. In that, like, okay, there were the evil communists, the evil empire, and then there was us, democracy, capitalism, that was good. And I think that for, again, myself and folks who are older than myself really have in the back of our minds this template that goes very much in reality. And I think people younger than myself especially are more influenced by are less influenced by those older tropes and more influenced by the fact that they can't get a job, that they can't afford a house, that they can't pay for medical care. How do we, is it just a matter of like what, Max Planck said, that, society, as opposed to science, advances one funeral at a time? Or do we? I don't think we can wait for that, because the planet is being destroyed. How do we get people's minds out of the past and make them look at what is happening and move to act on that?
Well, I think this is a great point, and this really cuts to the heart of the book, because the reason I wrote this book is because we have this politics that's just stuck in this divide between, liberals and those on the right. And the liberals say we need more state, and those on the right say we need less state and more market. And my whole argument is that basically all of these people are on the same team. And this is why things change superficially, but actually everything just stays the same. And people vote, but nothing changes, and they get angry because they think, well, politicians are all the same. And the argument that I make in the book is actually, we're told we have free markets and democracy, when in fact we have monopoly and oligarchy. Basically, we don't have free markets, we don't have competition, and we don't have real political contestation. And that is because what happens in politics and in government, the same as what happens in corporations, the same as what happens in all institutions, is shaped by what happens in society as a whole. So when one group has all the power, they can get their way everywhere. But when there's kind of counter power, when that power is more contested, as it was, for example, during the 40s, a bit in the 30s, when, the labor movement and unions had more power, society was more equal. Why was that? Well, it was because there were these powerful institutions and organizations that represented working people that were saying to politicians, you have to represent our interests.
Right.
And that is kind of what we lack a little bit now. So the book is really saying, look, we can't just keep having this debate about state or market, because both state and market are oriented towards supporting the power of those at the top. We need to build power at the grassroots. And that means a lot of different things. So yes, it means people need to be organizing in their workplaces. They need to get unionized. They need to hold the Jeff Bezoses of this world to account. But it also means, how do we think about organizing within our communities? Yeah. And one of my favorite parts of the book is at the end, where I've got these examples of grassroots community